Rome is going to go by pretty quickly for us in this course. I say more about this in class, but there's not an awful lot of new stuff that comes to us out of Rome. That's because Rome is a Hellenistic society. It pretty much adopts the Greek way of life, and by saying the Greek way of life, essentially we mean the Athenian way of life. Again, being a little broad there, but not too broad, I don't think. Well, I say more about this in class, about why very little new stuff comes to us out of Rome. But Rome goes by pretty quickly for us. There's not an awful lot of new things to talk about. There are some things that come out of Rome to talk about, which have had contributed to the development of Western culture. For example, in architecture, the arch. The arch is essentially a Roman contribution to Western architecture. The arch, which you see up here, the simple arch up here, is much stronger than the old column construction that comes to us out of ancient Greece. The old column and lintel construction. You don't have to worry about that word lintel. The lintel is just the part across the top up here, between the columns or between the posts of a door frame. The arch is much stronger than the column. If we look at some columns, here's some columns from a temple built to honor Zeus. It's somewhere in Greece, I forget where. As you look at the columns, I know you recognize these as Corinthian columns. See how much stuff you're learning? That's pretty cool. Well, if you ask the question, how much weight can you put on top of the columns? Now, the engineering majors can do all the math to work this all out for us, but just intuitively follow along with me. I think you'll understand what I'm getting at. If we ask how much weight can I put on top of the columns, the answer to that question actually doesn't have so much to do with the strength of the columns themselves. Now, of course that plays a role. But the crucial part of the system is this section of the column right here. Down the lintel here, the strength of that part of the structure determines how much weight you can put on top of the columns. Because as you keep piling more and more stuff on top of the columns, then, as you saw in the drawing earlier, there we go. You start putting a lot of weight down on top of that column, and it will bend and eventually crack. It'll break. It reaches a breaking point. But when we look at the arch, when you pile stuff on top of the arch, that weight is not suspended in the air, but instead is directed down through solid stone down to the ground, down actually to a foundation that you've dug into the ground. You see, when you have the column and you start piling stuff on top of the column, the weight is suspended in the air, but in the arch, it's directed more directly down to the ground. So the arch is a much stronger structure than the column construction is. Once you get the idea for the arch, you can build all kinds of things that you simply can't build with the columns. For example, if you go to page 21 in your textbook, you see a photograph of this aqueduct, a slightly different photograph, but the same aqueduct. You can build an aqueduct. What you're looking at here is an artificial river. Not the water that you're looking at, that's a real river, but the structure is an artificial river. That word aqueduct literally means a water carrier. Aqua is a Latin word that means water. Duct means to carry something, like the ventilation ducts carry air-conditioned air into the classroom and that kind of thing. What you have here is an artificial river. You have a series of 3 arches here. First, what an aqueduct is, and then why what you're looking at is a bit more impressive than just this little photograph would indicate to you. But first, what an aqueduct is. The very first week of class, I gave you a general principle of civilization. The first general principle of civilization, which was that in the ancient world, civilizations tended to develop alongside major rivers. And in fact, we went on to find that, with the exception of ancient Greece, every civilization in the ancient world developed alongside a major river. And the most important and most obvious reason for that is to get access to fresh water. But now we come to a problem with the system. If you build your city next to a major river, eventually you run into problems. And the big problem is that the water in the river that you're relying on for fresh water becomes polluted. That's because bathroom stuff gets into the river, and the river becomes polluted. Now, of course, if you have a little population next to the river, a little bathroom stuff gets into the water. But as it works out, the way the human body is designed, you can absorb a little bit of bathroom stuff. You can ingest a little bit of bathroom stuff, and it doesn't cause you a lot of problems. I know it's nasty to think about, but, well, if it weren't that way, we'd all have been dead by the time we were 2 years old or so. Your body can deal with a little bit of bathroom stuff. But a lot of it gets into the river. The population grows to a point where an awful lot of the bathroom stuff gets into the river. It doesn't flush downstream fast enough, and, well, then you have a problem. Well, then you have to come up with another source of water. Now, where do you find the freshest water? The freshest water is in mountain springs. That's what the Coors beer commercials say anyway. So here's what you do. Here is your city, over here, next to your polluted river. So you go out into the mountains, next to the city. I'm drawing this with a mouse, so there. You go. What was that? You go out into the. Oh, well, we'll leave it. I don't know what that's doing. Anyway, you go up into the mountains outside the city, and let's say up here. Oh, I can do this. Let me change my ink color. There. Let's just say up here there's a spring that's gushing out hundreds of thousands of gallons a day. Now that water is flowing downstream, flowing downhill, making waterfalls. That's kind of cool. Making waterfalls, and then a river that runs out of the valley. The problem is you don't want that river running out of the valley. You want that river over here in your city. So what you do is you send a team of people up into the mountains. You draw there. You draw an imaginary line from the spring down to your city, and then you build a series of arches, and this is an exaggerated view drawn with a mouse, so play along. These are the golden arches. These are a series of arches up to that line. And then you, let's go here. And then you lay your pipe along the top of those arches, and you bring your water down through the pipe into the city. That's what an aqueduct is. This top row of arches carries a pipe, or sometimes just a canal not cut in, but laid by the stones, to carry the water downhill into the city. So that's what you're looking at here. You notice how the aqueduct is built. It's built on a series of 3 arches. As you look at the photograph, you see that the bottom row of arches here is wider than the top row of arches. It's wide enough for people to walk on. It's wide enough over here for a car to drive on. Up here you see some people walking on the top of the top arch. Another person over here. And so once you've built the aqueduct, you've built a series of bridges up into the mountains. It makes it easier to cross rivers in the mountains. It makes it easier to exploit things in the mountains, like fur from wild animals and firewood and construction timber and metal from mines up in the mountains. All kinds of different things. Makes it easier to get down into the city. So you really by the time you've built your arches, and hopefully you've gotten some other springs, and you've connected a little network of aqueducts up here carrying water down into your city, then you can provide fresh water for the city. Now here's why what you're looking at is I'm trying to do something that's not working. Here's why what you're looking at is a bit more impressive than there we go. Here's why what you're looking at is a bit more impressive than just this little photograph would indicate to you. Just what you're looking at here is 160 feet tall. That's a 16-story building tall. There aren't any 16-story buildings in Marion County or Citrus County or Levy County, our Tri-County area. There aren't any 16-story buildings in Alachua County or Union County or Baker County or Gilchrist County or Dixie County or Pasco County or Lake County. You've got to do some driving to get to a 16-story building. And you know where the closest ones are: Jacksonville, Tampa, Orlando. You've got to do some driving. You'll be in the car for an hour and a half before you get to a 16-story building. And so it's taller than anything structurally around here. And the entire system, the entire network of aqueducts here is 31 miles long, bringing water down into a city in Roman France. 31 miles long. The pipe across the top of that aqueduct there is 10 foot square. 10 foot is probably the height of the ceiling in the room that you're watching this session on, because most ceilings in most houses are 10 feet tall. It's a pretty big pipe carrying a lot of water downhill. Someday I want to go there and rollerblade down that pipe. Wouldn't that be cool? Anyway, I've got some other photographs of aqueducts here to show you. You have in your textbook some others, at least one other as well. This is another view of another aqueduct in this system. You may notice the similarities in the architecture. This is the aqueduct at Segovia in Spain. You have that in your textbook. I give you that a photograph of that 81 miles long structure to carry water down into the city of Segovia. And some other views of aqueducts for you to look at. Once you've built your aqueduct and you've got water coming down into the city, though, you're doing more than just bringing water down into the city. If you noticed up here, you have some people standing on the aqueduct up here. Just to point out that these do serve as bridges. You can see some vehicles over here if you look closely. But once you've built the thing and you've got water coming down into your city, you've got more than just fresh water coming into your city. You've got water with power behind it. Let's say you start off with your aqueduct. You start off with a 10-foot square pipe. That pipe, it starts off 160 feet in the air on top of a 16-story building. That pipe brings water down to your city. If you build a pipe down here at the bottom, going straight up in the air, how high will the water go in that pipe? You start, the pipe is 10 foot square. The one end of the pipe is 16 stories high, 160 feet high. This pipe is 31 miles long. How high will the water go in this pipe? Some of you I know already have figured it out. It'll go to the same point, because water seeks its own level, right? And so the water will flow to 160 feet. That means that you can build a apartment building down here in your city with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stories in it, hook it up to the aqueduct, and you can bring water into your apartment with enough pressure at the top floors to be able to clean things and to flush bathroom stuff into a septic or sewer system. You've got water with power behind it. You've got a lot of weight behind that water. You can hook the water up to a water wheel. You've got water with a lot of power behind it. Imagine a pipe 10 foot square, 31 miles long, The other end is 16 stories high in the air. Can you imagine how much that water weighs at the bottom of that pipe? That's a lot of water pressure. You've got water pressure to do all kinds of things. You've got water with power behind it. I've got some photographs here on the screen to show you of some apartment buildings, or actually they're reconstructions of apartment buildings in ancient Rome. Here you have a drawing indicating a four-story apartment building and a reconstruction of another famous apartment building in the city of Rome. But you've got water with power to have with power and water pressure behind it to do something with it. Once you get the idea for the arch, you can come up with variations of the arch. Over here, you have a variation of the arch called a barrel arch. That's B-A-R-R-E-L. Called a barrel arch. It's because it looks like half a barrel. Cut a barrel in half long ways and used as a ceiling. You can build huge entrance hallways and palaces and all kinds of stuff with the barrel arch. Here's the entrance hallways to Constantine's palace. Constantine was one of the emperors. We'll talk about him later on in the semester. We catch up with Constantine. But here's the entranceway to one of his palaces, another view of the same palace structure. Here you have an amphitheater in Rome with those barrel arches used to support the wall and also to be able to support the ceiling. The architects and engineering majors can understand what I'm trying to get at, but you've got that long barrel arch that not only supports the wall but also provides a slope there for the seating. Here you have another sports arena, the Colosseum in Rome. You just can't build things of this size without the arch, you see. You could build a solid wall, I guess, all right, but it'd be awfully hot inside. If you want to let in fresh air and water, then you have to, well, you pretty much have to use the arch. The columns aren't strong enough to support the structures. Here's another view of the Colosseum. A massive sports stadium. It would have seated about 60,000 people. That's an awful lot of people you can pack into a stadium. That's a good-sized college football stadium today. There's also another variation of the barrel arch, commemorative arches like the Arch of Titus, which you have on page 23 in your textbook. Ceremonial arches built to honor armies that are returning home to Rome from successful military campaigns. There's really no entrances to the city of Rome because Rome thought of itself as one city. And so when there was a big military victory and soldiers came home, they would construct a special entrance to the city, pretend like that's the entrance to the city, then the soldiers would march through the archway and be welcomed back home. This arch, the Arch of Titus, built to honor Titus, a Roman general and later a Roman emperor, who conquers the city of Jerusalem. And then there's some information about the Arch of Titus there in your textbook. But a very famous ceremonial arch, and you see these arches across what we think of as the city of Rome, and in urban areas across what had been the Roman Empire. Another variation on the arch is down here. Once I find my cursor, there we go. Down here, and that's the dome. A dome is a variation on an arch. Again, the engineering majors get this quicker than the rest of us do, but if you think about that diagram, kind of spin that diagram around in your mind, you see that a dome is just a series of arches at angles to each other, all built up to a common meeting place. Once you get the idea for the dome, you can build big meeting places where you don't have to have annoying columns holding up the ceiling. The most famous example of the dome in Rome is a building called the Pantheon. You have this photograph in your, or photograph of the Pantheon in your textbook, not this one, on page 24 in your textbooks. There you see the dome on the Pantheon. The dome on the Pantheon is still today one of the largest solid domes. It's made out of concrete. I'm not talking about an inflatable dome over a basketball stadium or something, but a real solid dome. There's a structural limit as to how large you can build a dome before it starts to collapse on itself, and the Pantheon kind of pushes the envelope on how big a dome can be. I've got another photograph here of the Pantheon at night. I'm sometimes asked what it says across the top, or sorry, the front of the Pantheon. It's Latin. It says abbreviations being used, but it says Marcus Agrippus made this. Obviously built by an architect with a huge ego. Puts his name up there like that. You notice again the Corinthian columns. How about that? You notice those Corinthian columns there. Let's get that ugly ink stuff off. There we go. But the Pantheon at night. I've got in your textbook a architectural diagram of the Pantheon. It might help you. You notice the top part of the diagram, and in some of these photographs as well, it looks like the top of the dome is flat. It's actually not flat, it's empty. There's an empty space in the center of the Pantheon, an empty space called the oculus. If you come to us from the health sciences, you may recognize the root of that word oculus as having to do with the eyes. The oculus is a big hole in the center of the dome. It looks kind of like an eye. Here's another view of the oculus. This photograph actually taken by a former student of mine in HUM 1020. Went to Rome, took the photograph, sent it to me. It's a very nice photograph. You see the concrete there that makes up the dome. And some other views of the oculus. It's the major light source in this part of the Pantheon. It's kind of dramatic seeing that beam of light coming down into the room. And some more views of the oculus. To the left, that photograph was taken with a wide-angle lens, and so there's some distortion in the photograph, but you can see how the oculus works. That beam of light coming down into the room, kind of dramatic. I'm oftentimes asked how, what did people do when it rained? Well, I always have to say I don't know what people did when it rained. I know what they didn't do. They didn't stand underneath the oculus, because that is an empty space. More seriously, there is a way to deal with the rain. The tile in the floor, the grooves between the tile aren't by accident. They're there intentionally. You don't notice it at first. You don't notice it at all, really, until it rains. But the grooves connect to each other and slowly slope down towards one corner of the room or one side of the room where there's a small hole going outside, and so it has its own drainage system built into the floor. It's just kind of an interesting architectural detail that you don't really notice until it rains, and then the rainwater, there's a way for it to naturally flow right out of the building. Well, if I tell you that there are unique contributions from Rome to Western culture, and I start off with the arch, well, you know I'm kind of stretching for something. I mean, the aqueduct is kind of cool. The Pantheon is a cool place to visit, and a nice building and all that kind of stuff, but there's not a lot of new, exciting stuff, and that's because Rome is a Hellenistic society. There's not a lot of new things to talk about. We find that's the case when we look at philosophy in the Roman world. When we talk about philosophy in the Roman world, the first thing we notice is that there isn't an awful lot of it. We also notice that mostly it's the same people who've been doing philosophy who keep doing philosophy. There are very few people who identify themselves as Romans who are really all that interested in philosophy. Some Romans are, but not very many. Rome expands, eventually becomes by far the largest city in world history. It will eventually cover Greece and take over the city of Athens. And pretty much the philosophy is going to be done by Greek people coming out of the Athenian tradition, people who identify themselves as Greek and not as Romans. There are some Romans who are interested in philosophy. We'll talk about one at least, but just not very many of them. So first, there isn't very much philosophy. Most of it isn't being done by Romans. And, philosophy in the Roman period discussed some different types of big questions. Romans tended to be pretty practical-minded people. And philosophers who got attention in the Roman period tended to be those who tackled big practical questions. The big question for Roman philosophy, or philosophy in the Roman period, the big question the Roman philosophers wanted an answer to was, what is the best way to live? What's the secret to the good life? What's the best way to live? And of course there are lots of different answers to the question. But the two big answers to the question that come out of the philosophers of the Roman period, we'll be talking about. The first one, the philosophy of Epicureanism. Epicureanism, named for its founder, a guy named Epicurus. Here you see Epicurus portrayed in Raphael's painting, The School of Athens. We looked at that painting. It's on page 67 in your textbooks when we talked about Plato and Aristotle. You don't have to go there and look, but if you do, you'll find Epicurus there. The founder of Epicureanism. I think you'll be able to connect Epicurus and Epicureanism carefully enough. If you ask Epicurus, if you ask an Epicurean, what is the best way to live? What's the secret of the good life? The Epicurean answer, the best way to live is to seek pleasure. Well, that sounds pretty good. But if you're going to seek something, if you're going to look for something, you have to know what that something is. And, well, that just kind of makes sense. You have to define what pleasure is. So what is pleasure? Well, I've never thought about that before. Well, the Epicureans have, you see. The Epicureans define pleasure. Pleasure, the Epicureans define as the absence of pain. The Epicureans argue that you experience pleasure when you experience the absence of pain. And so to seek pleasure is to seek the absence of pain. And just using logic to work through the sentence, or not the sentence, but the, well, I guess it is a sentence, isn't it? It isn't. Anyway, just using logic to these words, to seek the absence of pain is to avoid pain. If you seek the absence of something, that means that you avoid it. And so to seek pleasure means to avoid pain. What's the secret of the good life? To avoid pain. Well, that sounds pretty good. Live life by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. But think about this. If you take that advice seriously, to avoid pain, what are some things that you're going to avoid? Well, it's a pretty long list. You would want to avoid fire, broken glass, work. Work's a pain. We could all have a contest about who's had the cruddiest job, and I bet most of us would win. I've had some pretty cruddy jobs, and you have too, probably. School. School is a pain. If you want to avoid pain, you want to avoid taking Introduction to the Humanities, HUM 1020. I'll be talking to you in a little bit about how to prepare for the first midterm exam, and the word fun isn't going to leave my lips. School's a pain. Kids are a pain. First of all, delivering them if you're a woman, and then having any contact with them thereafter, regardless of your gender. Love will kill you every time. Friends. You want to be hurt, have some friends. Friends can really hurt you. Well, you come up with a list of a lot of things. But I think you kind of catch on to what I'm getting at. Some things on that list are things that any reasonable person wants to avoid. Walking on broken glass, avoiding flame. But there's also an awful lot of stuff on that list that brings pain, which an awful lot of people have reported actually do bring some pleasure. I mean, kids are a pain. I know kids are a pain, but it's kind of fun to have kids around. Kids are kind of cool. It's kind of fun to have kids around. In small doses sometimes, but hey, kids are cool. Kids are fun. It's good to have kids around. School's a pain. I know that. I remember my first day of first grade. I remember my first grade teacher. Her name was Mrs. Lackey. I thought she was the prettiest lady in town next to my mom. And she was nice and sweet, and I remember my first day of first grade and going to school and being kind of nervous and sitting there in those little chairs. Remember those little chairs you had in first grade? Remember when they didn't seem little? They were just chairs. And then someday you got big enough to notice them. Hey, those are little chairs. And we sat there, and I remember her. She was so pretty and so sweet. And she said, learning is fun. And you probably had a first grade teacher, too, who told you learning was fun. Those lying, miserable first grade teachers, how can they do that? Look those little kids in the face and tell them learning is fun. Oh, but I bought it. She was nice and pretty and sweet, and man, I bought it. And then I found out the truth. Learning isn't fun. Learning's hard work. You know what learning is. Learning is 4 o'clock in the morning with a college algebra textbook on the kitchen table, trying to figure out quadrilateral equations. Learning isn't fun. Learning is hard work. You remember Plato's allegory of the cave, the guy climbing out of the cave? When he got to the top of the climb, did he say, that was fun? No, man, that's hard work. But is it worth the hard work to get out of the cave? Is it worth the hard work to learn stuff? Well, it's pretty cool to know things. Aren't you glad somebody made you sit down and learn all those stupid letters and the sounds they make so that you can read things? That's a great gift somebody gave you. And yeah, learning's hard. We've all had cruddy jobs, but you know, you can work those cruddy jobs and eventually get to a place where you have a career for yourself, a career that you really enjoy, a career that brings pleasure to life, a career that at the end of the day, you say, hey, I did a good thing today. I did some good things that you have pride in, that you feel good about. And some advice to you, you know, most of you are in the process of choosing a career. You know, why not choose one that fulfills something about you, that makes you feel good about what you do? Most Americans just choose a career that provides a paycheck, and then they live their lives on the weekends or when they have a day off or whatever. But why not choose a career that you find rewarding? I mean, why not? Well, I think you see what I'm getting at here. You can come up with a long list of things to avoid pain, but you end up avoiding life. Avoiding a lot of things that people say actually do bring pleasure. You end up missing out on an awful lot of things. You certainly can structure your life to avoid pain, but you end up a pretty sad, miserable, lonely person. The alternative answer, or one alternative, but the big alternative for the Roman period, Stoicism. It'd be difficult to give you one founder of Stoicism. There are a lot of big names early on. But one of the first big names, at least, a guy named Epictetus. You see a depiction of Epictetus here on the screen. He's one of the first big names for Stoicism, but by far the biggest name of a Stoic philosopher, the biggest of the Stoics, the most famous, a guy named Marcus Aurelius. If you kind of instinctively have a thing for languages, you may notice that Marcus Aurelius is a different language than Epicurus or Epictetus. He's a Roman. That's a Latin name. He's one of the few Romans who's really interested in philosophy. Actually, he later becomes one of the Roman emperors. You see a statue of him there on the screen, and a coin depicting him as an emperor. Epictetus, if we go back for a second, Epictetus had been a slave. Marcus Aurelius became an emperor, and the Stoics were very proud of this, that their two big philosophers, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, one had been a slave and one had been an emperor, that people from different social classes, different positions in life had not only formed Stoicism, but were attracted to it as a philosophy. It was widely attracted to an awful lot of people in Rome. Well, for Stoicism, if you ask a Stoic philosopher, what is the secret to the good life? What's the best way to live? The Stoic philosopher says the best way to live is to be happy. The secret to the good life is to be happy. Well, again, this sounds very simple. But if you're going to be something, you have to know what that something is. So you have to know what happiness is. What is happiness? What does it mean to say that you are happy? Well, I've never thought about that before. Well, the Stoic philosophers have. The Stoic philosophers define happiness. You are happy when you get what you want. Well, that makes sense. I'm happy when I get what I want. Most of the time, anyway. I'm happy when I get what I want. Well, the Stoic philosopher says we know the secret. You can get what you want all the time. And you say, did I hear that right? I can get what I want all the time? All the time. 24/7, 24/7, 365. 366 in leap years. I can get what I want about everything. All the time, all the time. I can get what I want all the time, all the time. Well, here's the secret. The secret is that you make a decision. And that decision is that what I want is whatever life has for me. I want whatever life has for me. Because you'll always get whatever. If you go into a restaurant and server comes up to you and says, can I get you a menu? And you say, I don't need a menu, just bring me something to eat. And the server says, what do you want to eat? And you say, I don't care, whatever. What are you going to get? The most expensive item on the menu, you already figured that one out, but you're going to get whatever. Can you make any complaint? No. You said, whatever. And what did you get? Whatever. Because you'll always get whatever. In other words, you give up your particular desires for particular things. A desire for a particular job, or a particular car, or a particular friendship, or a relationship, or you give up particular desires for everything. And you simply accept what life has for you. You accept your fate in life. You accept, can I spell it out here with my, no, I messed up. Messed up again. Stick with me. There we go. I was going to try to write fate on there. F-A-T-E, fate. You accept your fate in life. Whatever life has for you, you don't struggle against it. You don't have particular desires for things. You just accept whatever life gives you. And you're happy because you got what you want. Good things, bad things, whatever. When we look at Epicureanism and Stoicism, well, there's two different answers. Epicureanism says to withdraw from the world. Withdraw from the world because something in the world might hurt you. The Epicurean wakes up in the morning and double checks the doors to make sure that everything is locked, so that the bad, evil, painful world stays away and that everything is kept away. The Stoic confronts the world. The Stoic wakes up in the morning, walks out the front door, and says, whatever life has for me, that's what I want to have. Two different answers to a basic question. What's the best way to live? I'm myself not satisfied with either one of them, okay? There are lots of other alternatives out there, but these are the two that were popular in the Roman world and the two big philosophies that come out of the Roman period. When we look at the Hellenistic world, looking at Alexander's empire and Rome together, we talked about Alexander's empire in the first online session of the Hellenistic world, and now looking at Rome in the second. If we put those two empires together, here's Alexander's empire from Macedonia and Greece all the way down to Egypt, across where Israel is today, where Iraq is today, where Iran is today, where Pakistan is today, up through where Afghanistan is today, across where the Ukraine is today, where Turkey is today. A big part of the Earth's surface. When we look at Rome, if I can find my cursor, there we go. Now I know why it's called a cursor. All the way from, let's just say the border of England and Scotland, down across Northern Europe, Spain, Portugal, the Atlantic world, all the way across Roman Africa, what we call North Africa today, up through where Israel, Syria, Turkey is today, across much of Eastern Europe, Northern Europe. When we put these two maps together, the Hellenistic world is going to cover, a big part of the Earth's surface. Just putting together the Roman world and Alexander's world, it's a pretty big part of the Earth's surface that will be a Hellenistic world. People who aren't themselves Greek, but who will come to adopt Greek language, Greek culture, the Greek religion, and the impact of Athens grows far beyond just a little bitty town in Greece to cover a big part of the Earth's surface.